Guerios, you have about 10 minutes to present your work, and then, of course, we'll discuss it. Please.
Thank you very much, Professor Metlica. So, hello, everybody. Thank you for being here. I would like to start by thank you all for your presence. And I would like to present my thanks to the Caripara Foundation for founding my PhD, to the University of Padova for offering me an outstanding locus of research, and to all the panelists, Martin, who I met in my first conference in Paris back in 2018, and Professor King, who organized a book, a volume that was very valuable for my research. And me and Metlica, we've met many times in Padua in several events by the university. I also would like to present my thanks to Professor Emanuele Zinato, who is my supervisor, for his valuable advice and insights. So I'll try to operate a miracle right now and try to present in 9 minutes my for almost 5 years of research. So I started working with cholera in 2016 when I was preparing my research proposal for the University of Padua. And as you know, my PhD thesis is entitled Cholera and the Literary Imagination in Europe from 1830 to 1930. And I suppose that if we discount the three panelists, nobody else in the room has read the work, so I will try to present it very briefly. It is composed of an introduction and 5 chapters. In the introduction, I discuss the concept of the medical humanities, which has been blossoming for the past 20 years. This area of connection between the health humanities and the humanities in general. So the health sciences and humanities, history, literature, etc. My work, I also present in my introduction, my methodology. This work is an interdisciplinary work. I analyze discourses from medical discourses, historical discourses, and literary discourses. And my corpus is... Just a second, guys. Zeudi, mi puoi togliere di co-host? Perché sennò tutti i suoni mi arrivano qua le persone che devono entrare. Per favore.
Però se ti tolgo host non puoi condividere lo schermo.
Ah, va bene. Ok, allora però sentite i suoni? Perché ogni volta che qualcuno entra nella stanza mi...
No, ma non faccio entrare più nessuno allora, va bene?
no, dai, poverini, fagli entrare, grazie. Okay, so brief intermission. My corpus is composed of about slightly more than 150 texts from multiple literary traditions. So I've worked with texts in English, German, Portuguese, Spanish, French, and Italian, but I also worked with different literary traditions such as Russian, but I read those in translations. And all of my texts of my corpus, they're brief. Most of them some are poems, short stories, novellas, but some occasionally lengthy novels. And all of them are comprised within roughly 100 years, from more or less the 1830s to the 1930s. In the first chapter, I discuss briefly the history and the science of cholera. There were 7 pandemics. And actually cholera, although we look at it as a vanquished disease, cholera has never disappeared. We are right now in the 7th pandemic still. Cholera was terrifying, a disease with very high mortality rate, and it is related as well to the sanitary reform movement. So it's one of the it's one of the things that is moving the sanitary reforms of the 19th century, which will have a high impact on the rise of life expectancy later on in the 20th century. I also analyzed the cultural impact cholera had in society, which is quite significant. Then in chapter 2, we start to dive into literature, and I start by discussing fatalism and hysteria, once a new disease appears, and especially a new pandemic, some people will naturally react with fatalism, so as if the apocalypse had come. And that is very human, it's very understandable. And that's partially what happened during cholera as well. So there were many promises of doom and gloom, especially in the early years. And this is my favorite example, a physician speaking in the USA before the arrival of cholera, and he says this: "Cholera has opened a broader outlet of human life than any other epidemic disease. With energies more terrific than plague or yellow fever, it admits of no equal in the celerity and fatality of its attacks. In its devastations too, it has no competitor, but reigns supreme over every other destroyer of the human race." So what is the Black Death compared to cholera? Of course, cholera is much, much worse. So that's what the kind of fatality you hear about. And so I tried I argued that literature is part of this. I interpreted Mary Shelley's The Last Man under this light, so in a certain sense as a preparation for imminent catastrophe. I've tried to show how the new plague from Asia that is represented in this novel actually is related, is cholera, basically. I've also tried to compare it with the Journal of the Plague Year, in the sense that both novels they both seem to be a preparation for incoming catastrophe. In chapter 3, we go to the other extreme of the spectrum, and I talk about laughter and denial. By the very same principle, people naturally people react with denial once tragedy happens. And we have been experiencing this at this very moment with the coronavirus pandemic. So it is a natural reaction, but at the same time, since part of the social discourses on cholera were so cataclysmic, they naturally invited for ridicule. We see this, for example, in Heinrich Heine Französische Zustände, so the French letters, two of which deal with cholera, and he describes, for example, a relationship between cholera and carnival, which I consider apocryphal. I think it's made up, and because there is a long tradition in plague writing connecting both things, the comic, the carnival, and the chaos of the epidemic. There is also one relevant thing, that laughter is used as a coping strategy. So quite often, by laughing at something, it becomes more familiar. So in this caricature, for example, we see alcohol was supposed to prevent cholera, and so we see children being given brandy here and getting drunk. So it's kind of cute. Chapter 4 deals with cholera and taboo. So in three different axes: fear, silence, and disgust. I start by discussing the medicalization of fear. So fear by itself could induce cholera, according to 19th century science. We see this in a letter by Goethe. The poems made me so wretched that I quickly threw the book aside. When cholera is imminent, one must avoid all depressing and enervating influences. So you should not, cholera it's not a joke. You should not read preoccupying things during cholera. And therefore, since fear can be bad for you, literature can act as a medicine. So in this short novel by Jules Janin, a physician recommends to a cholera-stricken victim, hurry, madam, read Monsieur de Balzac, Contes Drôlatiques, and console yourself. So these short stories are funny. They are erotic as well, kind of. And so by reading them, this lady would be cured, or at least avoid cholera. Finally, since discussing cholera may induce cholera, literature tries to keep silent about it quite often, and quite often it also sanitizes the symptoms, so we get away with all the vomiting and the diarrhea. And perhaps the best example of that is found in Death in Venice, because unlike you and me, Aschenbach, when he contracts cholera, he just has a little bit of sweat in his brow, so no vomiting, no disgusting symptoms at all. Finally, the last chapter, chapter 5, in my last minute, I discuss cholera and the poor. Cholera is a disease of poverty, like pretty much every contagious diseases there are, like the plague, like typhus, like tuberculosis. If you're poor, you're more likely to contract them and to develop them. So the rich, they are better off, but they are not immune. But in literature, culturally, you start to get this myth that the rich cannot contract cholera somehow. And you see this in Georges Sand's Lélia. So this rich woman, she has contracted cholera, and her physician says, "You have cholera, my beautiful angel. A disease which kills in 2 hours those who are weak, but which is not dangerous for firm spirits like ours." And this spirits like ours, this ours actually means we the rich. I also try to show how cholera is considered a low theme, so it's a theme for the roman feuilleton, for low fiction, low literature. And I try to show how on the 20th century, this theme will be embraced by the avant-garde, the European avant-garde of the early 20th century. And finally, I try to show how the poor are linked to cholera and how they are very often portrayed as a barbaric menace coming from within. They are always in a crowd, they are faceless, they have no names, they speak foreign languages, they are savages, and therefore they are an inside menace whose disease could corrode society from the inside. That's what we see here in this absurdly named novel, Les Mohicans de Paris. So you have a Native American nation at the heart of Paris. And at the very end, I tried to show how many of these topoi of the cholera imagination dialogue in a certain sense. They have ties with the rising fascist movements of the 1920s and 1930s. So that's what I've been doing in the past 5 years. And that's my study of the cholera imagination in Europe. Thank you very much. Sorry for all the sounds.
Don't worry. Thank you, Dr. Lustosa Guerios, for your presentation. So now is the moment of the panel discussion. So please, dear colleagues, if you want to start. I don't know who's gonna be the first, please. Professor.
I'm very happy to start, but Martina, would you like to ask the first question?
I'm happy if you start, and then
thank you very much. Thank you. It's very kind. Aureo, thank you very much for your presentation, and hello everybody else as well. Just before I pose my question, how nice it is to be in a European PhD Viva like this, which has such a community feel to this last aspect of it. Very unlike how it happens here in the UK, where very private kind of meetings. This is hugely enjoyable. Having done one or two of them, I always enjoy this collective discussion. Aureo, thank you so much for the presentation. I thoroughly enjoyed the thesis, and congratulations on the research involved in putting that together. It was, in my view, a work of substantial research, which clearly represents 5 years of extremely hard work on your part, and I commend you for it. Let me start by asking a very broad question, really, of the organisation and structure of the thesis, very broadly speaking. You made a decision here to organise the chapters around, I suppose, human emotions in a sense. The second chapter on fatalism and hysteria, the third on laughter and denial, etc. Obviously, there are other ways one could organise a thesis like this. Why did you make the choice to focus in the way that you did from 2 to 5, following that really interesting first chapter that obviously focused on the science and the medicine of cholera as a disease and its etiology? Why that focus on emotion rather than, say, a focus on perhaps the politics of cholera or the social impact of cholera, etc., which would have been an alternative way to go?
Thank you, Martin. So that's a very good question. And I think my answer will start by thinking about what is outside of the thesis, actually, right? Because there's so many things to say, especially after the start of the coronavirus pandemic, because I was writing the thesis when coronavirus started. So that changed many things as well. In the introduction previously, I had to be arguing the whole time that this is relevant because pandemics could happen again, and when they happen, many of the things might reoccur. So that changed completely, and many things were left out as well. I tried, I think, to find some axes which could tie the most things. I do feel kind of sad that the thesis is already quite long, but I would like to write it even longer. I would like to add still 2 chapters, and so for the first part, it was supposed to focus on these emotions, which I see as contrasting, right? So they give us a large spectrum, and I do think that between this one extreme of denial and one extreme of fatalism, which we have seen once again arise in the coronavirus, quite often in the same individual, right? So politicians, they would say one thing when the coronavirus was far away, and another thing when it was at their doors. And so I tried to find something that would fit all of the texts. And then I do think that the things that were left out also help me here, or actually play against me here, because the chapter of about the poor should be followed by a chapter about cholera as Asiatic. So you would have the menace within and the menace without. And unfortunately, I didn't have enough time for that. But I hope to continue pursuing that, perhaps in a postdoc or something. I hope I replied to your question.
That's great. Thank you very much. Martina.
Okay, I think I directly connect to this question. And before I go more into detail, I also want to ask some kind of general questions. First of all, of course, it's really great, and it's very impressive because you gathered actually a lot of material. And I think what is missing, I mean, there are cholera counts. There's, for example, Olaf Griese, which you could have taken a bit more into account. But they all are sort of national philologies, if they do philology at all. And I think your comparatist approach is really extraordinary, because this is something that's missing, and basically it's also missing in plague writing. And I think from the standpoint of comparative literature, and I'm not a comparativist, it sounds to me really, really impressive. But I think there are also methodological questions that are, of course, perhaps they can't be solved in such an endeavor, but that doesn't mean that they are not there. So my general question, or the rather big question, would be, do you want to understand literature, or do you want to understand the cultural history of cholera? And I think one could, of course, say yes, both. But still, the decisions has somehow to be made. And I think sometimes I have the impression that you have a kind of top-down idea of first comes medicine, or first comes what happens in society, and then comes literature. And literature is kind of an echo of what happens within medical history or social history. Which means that you have a perhaps rather narrow concept of literature having a very clear function. And since you deal with highly canonical texts and sort of belletristic texts and entertainment texts, perhaps the concept of literature that you need should be a bit more distinct, or distinguish between these kind of canonical literature. And then where's the question about poetology? Where's the question about structural plots and so on? And I think this connects exactly to what Martin said, because I also wonder, I mean, to me it sounds so as being a historian of medicine, it sounds quite clear that there are all these patterns and there are stereotypes. And of course, you're entirely right. They come from plague writing and plague responses, denial, laughter, terror, abandonment, and so on. But if this is your methodological decision, you kind of put literature, or you are at least at risk to put literature into the second rank as being an eco. And if you turn it upside down and ask, for example, about Balzac and the Contes Drôlatiques, one, of course, has to ask the question, what did epidemics serve for? For people who were artists, or epidemics were of tremendous use to people, like apparently Balzac inscribing himself in a wonderful and very canonical tradition. Oh, let's go to Thucydides, Boccaccio, and here I am. So apparently this is an author who really needs a kind of self-positioning in a booming literary market, which is also a booming press market in the first part of the 19th century. And cholera was a wonderful moment for him to kind of bring himself forward as the coming author. And if you go on with this decision that literature as an echo, you are at least at risk of missing this kind of turning the screw the other way around, if you know what I mean. So perhaps you could just...
Sure, that is. Thank you very much for the comment, and Professor King. That's extremely relevant, and I agree. I subscribe to all of your comments. I do agree that it gives this impression that literature is secondary. It's a kind of the flip of the coin of medical and political discourses, which would be above it. It can give this impression, but I certainly don't think that's the case. I do agree that epidemics serve artists as well, and that's why they change it so much. So it may give the impression that sometimes I'm trying to get if the authors got the facts right or not. But it's literature. Anything can happen. Who cares if cholera kills 50% of the time, and in literature it kills 99% of the time? It doesn't really matter. They can do it. We're within the realm of fiction. I think one of the reasons why this happens in the thesis, and I completely agree that this comes true, is that because cholera is usually called, it's invoked under the guises of the plague. So quite often we see scholars actually not noticing that cholera is around. I've quoted from Evans, which is an extremely eminent historian and really knows his history, and he's saying in Cholera in Hamburg that there is no significant literary tradition on cholera, and I think he's right in a sense, because this literary tradition does not use the word cholera; it uses the word plague, and in order to argue that when they say plague they actually intend cholera, I have to be double checking with medical discourses and so try to play this game of if they got it right. But I completely agree with you that literature is not subservient to that, and they do use it, and in many extremely interesting ways. I'm very interested in the broad phenomenon of disease in literature as a whole, not only cholera. And I do think that it goes both ways, actually. I do think that literature is influenced by other types of discourses, economical, politics, etc. But at the same way, literature mirrors the values of societies and the expectations. So it's at the same time shaping what's happening and being shaped by what is happening. So yeah, and I do think we can grasp a bit of that with all this topoi, because when you look from Thucydides to I don't know, Camus, the topoi are really so sometimes fossilized. Even they are so constant, and that this is and sometimes they're not, and that's very interesting as well. But I find it quite amazing how the narratology of epidemics is so similar in so many of my texts, and also I do think that also it's a byproduct of this type of research, because it's so broad that that we will lose, of course, the minutiae of the analysis, which is also a pity because I love close reading, for example, and my master's is on the Divine Comedy, and I only talk about it for the whole dissertation. So this is a very different approach, and I think very comparative, very broad approaches like this, this is a collateral effect, I would say, and I have to accept this criticism for sure.
I would still suggest, if you, I don't know, for publication, if you accept some kind of, I don't know, comments or overworking things, I would in an exemplary way, I would do some close readings in order not to be ahistorical. You know, I mean, it's very impressive, but still, if you have such a huge corpus and you only touch things and surfaces, and then you very often jump between cholera and plague, and of course that's totally justified because I see the patterns, but still, not in order to miss the autonomy of literature. And perhaps you subconsciously think it mirrors. And I would be very cautious about this kind of mimetic assumptions, because you deal with very substantial and very canonical texts from the 19th century, even starting with Heine. Of course, it is considered journalism, but it is the most canonical work, one of the most canonical work of the early 19th century in German prose, experimenting with a new genre. So I would really be careful and cautious and give a warning not to have this reflex on it mirrors, because it has always been there, because it's always like plague writing, because perhaps think like epidemics are a tool and they always serve at something. And these are all people, I mean, not everybody, of course not the Mystère de Paris, but you deal with Balzac, and you deal with Heine, and you deal with Thomas Mann, which is, of course, not a satire. So be careful and just say, what was the use of cholera in this very example? And go a bit deeper into the texts and ask, and never drop literary autonomy. I think this is a bit, and this does not come necessarily with your broad comparatist approach. I think it can't be. It can be prevented, the loss of autonomy.
Sure. Thank you very much. That's great advice. Thank you. I'll think about it dearly. Thank you.
I might actually follow on from that in a way. I had another question, but this is so interesting and an area for discussion that I'll try to ask something that's more closely associated. So I think that where I would absolutely agree with Martina's perspective on this, Aureo, and your own answer to her question actually gave some real indications, I think, of how your thinking and mine, as you'll see in a moment, are quite close on this, is that one of the things perhaps that's missed out in a broad comparative perspective that as you have, and one that is also so speedily trans-historical, is, and where the trans-historical is across each chapter, so that you're shuttling back and forward temporally, is that you of course miss a sense of influence, because you're not looking to do that. It's not a criticism of what you have done. It would be another project. And in a way, what you therefore miss is what an 1850s text might draw from an 1830s text. That is, you don't put the literary representation centrally and then ask, how did that inform later literary representations? Which, of course, is a different question to ask than those you've posed. But what did occur to me in thinking of that in terms of the answer you've just given is that it seems as though actually you've got a sense of there being a genre that you might call cholera fictions, which have central topoi that are similar across time. I wonder whether you might say a little bit more about that, because that wasn't apparent in the thesis as it's presented just now, but it's clear that it's emerged for you a little bit. So a reader would think lots of different texts drawn from a variety of genres and from a variety of national literatures. Fascinating comparative approach. But you've just suggested that there are also maybe topoi, themes, genre characteristics possibly, where there's similarities. What are those similarities? I'd just love to hear kind of one or two of your thoughts on the connections across.
Sure. Thank you, Martin. There are a few, actually. One of them, for example, is this focus on the crowd. So the plague or cholera or influenza, they're very often, very often, of course, not always, of course, but often represented as a disease of all, right? Because an epidemic affects all by definition. So it's seen as a disease of the crowd. And quite often we get titles that involve the names of cities, like the plague in Bergamo or the cholera of Rome or something like that. It's quite different from the representation of cancer, in which often we have a name of a character, the death of Ivan Illich or something. So it is de-individualized, I think. Quite often you don't even have a character. It's just like the city works as a big character. And I find this very interesting because the 20th century will have many things to do. This is one of the topoi of modernism, actually, right? So this is one of the things, this blending of diseases. It's also something I also find it very interesting. Literature is not really concerned about the boundaries of what is one thing and what is the other. Actually, quite often we mash all of them together into one type of representation. I do find also quite interesting that epidemics very often serve as a way to deal with a microcosm, right? So I don't know, that's used in Thomas Mann as, I don't know, the Magic Mountain, for example. Clearly, it is supposed to be a microcosm of European intelligentsia of the time, and etc. And we do see this in the cholera texts as well. There are many eulogies as well. So sometimes when specific people are identified, there is an effort to cry the loss over them or to praise their lives. One thing that I have not analyzed in the thesis, but I'm still pondering about is the relationship between cholera and epic poetry, especially in Italy. It's quite often we find the imitations of the terzine, the Dante's terzine, and I think that's due to Petrarch's triumphs. And it's quite funny because you have this epic poetry about the disease. In French as well, there are a few epic poems as well. The carnival appears all around, so it's not only in Heine, but in many instances. And also live burials. I think that's one of the fascination of the 19th century. It's not only connected to cholera, it's also linked, for example, to the resurrectionists stealing bodies and everything. But live burials were a true fear of the 19th century, right? And one of the things is because cholera can induce this comatose state. It's kind of rare, but it happens, and we do have evidence that it truly happened on a somewhat. There was some basis for it. In literature, however, you see it all the time. And many plots, they work precisely because someone appeared to be dead, then people started to react in a certain way, and then this person comes back alive. So yeah, some of them are structural, others are just thematic.
Thanks very much, Aureo. Martina, would you mind if I just ask a very quick follow-up to that? Aureo, how does the broader field of medical humanities influence the way that you have gone about deciding on the organisation? Because I think that's probably quite key to this as well, isn't it? Is that you aren't writing a literary history or a history of cholera. It's a medical humanities approach. What would you say was the influence of that kind of scholarship and that way of working on the way that you've organised the material?
Great question, Martin. Great question. I think it was super important, especially in the beginning, because when I was still conceiving of the project, when preparing my research proposal, I read everything I could lay my hands on that was the name of a disease followed by literary imagination. So there is smallpox in the literary imagination. There is a work by Biden, which is called Tuberculosis and the Literary Imagination, etc. So I read all of this, as many as I could, to get a glimpse of how it's done. Most of these studies of the literary imagination within the medical humanities, they focus on one tradition. There is actually der Cholera in der deutschen Literatur, by Schaffer, which is also one such study within one national tradition and a thematic study. So I think I modeled myself a lot on this kind of inquiries, which quite often as well follow this pattern, although usually they do what Professor King suggested, that they are like, they do more close reading. Usually they I don't know, select 4 or 5 representative novels usually, and then discuss about those, but also with many appendices and parallel discussions on other texts, but much shorter. And I guess one of the reasons why I didn't want to do this is because I love to read as broadly as I can. So there is also a personal reason, I think, to have a glimpse of many literary traditions at the same time, rather than focusing on only one. Because also, being broad natural phenomenon which afflict the whole world, it seems odd to me that we look only within one tradition to think about the representation of pandemics. If we imagine how forests are imagined in literature, it doesn't really. Brazil has a lot to say about forests, a lot, but only the literary imagination we find in Brazilian literature, for sure, it will not be enough. So I think this broadly comparative, and of course, this type of work, they involve hundreds, sometimes dozens of scholars, for sure, right? So yeah.
Thanks very much, Aureo.
Shall I go on?
Please, Professor King.
Okay. So let's perhaps talk a bit more about this kind of methodology or your approach, which is on one hand very convincing because you gather a lot of material, and of course pandemics or global things are never entirely grasped and understood if one looks, for example, at one national philology. Of course, that doesn't work. And so this is very convincing. What I find less convincing is your jumps in time, because as Martin said, you tend to jump backwards and forwards, and then this turns out to be rather an ahistorical gathering of motives and stereotypes, like the philanthropist in 19th century fiction is succeeded by the superhuman hero of the contemporary comic. I don't get what you want to say, because it's apparently obvious, but in order to make such a claim, would perhaps be less ahistorical, less generalizing. It is just an example. So to go further, because that's really interesting, and also the question about how does that touch the medical humanities is really interesting, because it's a field I really sort of try to give my own contributions to, and I think such a general count on cholera is really necessary and hasn't been there. But I think in order to avoid being ahistorical, you would also need a bit more historical medical context. And I wanted you to perhaps comment on this, because what I was wondering, or it struck me, that you start with a medical and not a historical medical context. And why that? I mean, it's a monograph in history or in literary history. And I think you don't need 50 pages of current medical information, the state of the art. What, of course, you perhaps can say this is a coma bacillus and it has that and that size and it infects people and it, I don't know, there's Anelella cyclase and what the pathomechanisms are. But you go so deeply into the subject that I thought, listen, this is not a medical textbook. Instead, what is missing are details, the concrete and necessary details of concept development and institutional development in the 19th century. I was really looking it up, looking where is it, And I think this is crucial because you can't write a literary history and a cultural history on cholera in the 19th century, comparative, with leaving out Chadwick, the Poor Law, a deeper insights into the British sanitary movement, which was really, the first step into battling or the combat against cholera. So there are many people that I was searching for and couldn't find them. Thomas Arthur Smith, epidemiology and the statistics of epidemiology, the onset of the statistics. And then there was a moment when you described something where you said, oh, this is I think it was this American doctor, and it was just one, perhaps random publication of an American doctor who said something was not contagious and then it became contagious. And you call that a paradoxy. But this is not a paradoxy. This is a concept which was very prevalent in the midst of the 19th century. It's called Contingent Contagionism. And it's, I think, basically first promoted by Arthur Smith and then other people, British people, who always had this ongoing debate between contagionists and anti-contagionists. So where was the Ackerknecht thesis? So there's a lot about the medical context that is really necessary in order to understand why they start with hysteria. This kind of history of emotions, why they start with hysteria and denial. And then later on, they can pin it down and they can mention it and they can say this is cholera because there was the point of defining the disease by a bacterium. And of course, you mentioned the major steps, but I think there was so much in between, and that is missing. And I would really, would be my suggestion to leave out all the medical stuff at the beginning, because that is really not necessary part of a monograph in the humanities and basically not in medical humanities, but really go deeper into the medical context, the historical context, and read primary sources. Where were the primary sources? There's really a lot to understand. And if you want to do that comparatively, I would seriously suggest that you don't leave out the medical sources. They are very easy to find. They are all online. Everything is online. And it would give just a clearer picture also for the close reading of the literary text, just because it's a necessary context.
Sure. Thank you for the comment. I think the medical part is there because I expected the reader to, especially in the beginning. So I actually wrote the thesis in its order, and so it is a point in the work in which it's still molding itself. And my concern is that to give the science first in order for people to understand. When I say that, people say plague, but actually they mean cholera. What is the rationale behind it? So I think that's the reason why I went into details over the science of cholera. Also because I was interested in discussing the origin problem. So we take for granted that cholera originates in India, but there have been recent challenges which are quite convincing, at least it has convinced me. And then once again, this discussion in the end is not really taken forward again because there should have been a chapter on an Indian cholera, which would have tied perhaps this medical part to something that would have come later. So it's something I'll definitely look into and take your considerations or advice in consideration when I look for perhaps the book publication. About the medical the rationale behind it, the medical status, that's definitely necessary. I do know about. I called it a paradox because he says it's contagious and non-contagious, and of course that both things, they can be true. It can be contagious under some circumstances and non-contagious under others. So it's not necessarily a paradox. Perhaps I'm phrasing myself poorly. What I wanted to intend with this particular example is that there was definitely a huge debate, and I actually dealt with many of these medical treatises. They don't appear that much, I agree, but I have definitely taken them into account. I tried to discuss them briefly, very, very briefly. I don't know, Jon Snow appears in the chapter 1, but chapter 1 is already so large, right? Some of my friends who read it and gave me advice before I submitted the thesis, actually, some people advised me to just cut this in half. You don't need all of this. And so, I think this is one of the things that was left out, but it's worthy reevaluating that. Thank you.
If I may, just a very quick comment. I think that the colleagues are right. These are very precious suggestions. And if one day you will rewrite this thesis in order to make a book of it, and I'm sure that you will do it, maybe some radical choice about the organization, the articulation of the whole thesis would be necessary. But I also want to stress that, yes, there are some methodological issues, some choices that could have been made, but this is because the general framework is very ambitious, and I really appreciated it. Of course, it is risky to adopt a transversal approach, an interdisciplinary attitude, to analyze such a wide-ranging corpus of texts. But I think that the argumentation remains clear, logic, well-developed, and in this respect, the thesis is a remarkable piece of scholarship, in my opinion. Of course, there are some risks. I think that Professor King is right in stressing that this articulation, so adopting an interdisciplinary attitude, literature, medical humanities, social history, while also stressing the point of view of literature, is not easy. But I think that you made a great job, and of course, it could be specified maybe sometimes your methodological stand, but I do think that the work is really remarkable when it comes to all this corpus that's very well analyzed. I don't have a proper question, and then I will leave the floor to the colleagues for the next questions, but maybe something more could be said about what's not in there. It was the question by Professor Willis, because actually you talk a lot within the thesis about Orientalism and the Asian cholera, and of course we know that a chapter was planned, and then a lot of materials are still there, but maybe you didn't have the time to properly articulate all the materials about that specific topic. I think this is a weak spot for the work, because the work is already comprehensive and very rich, both in primary and secondary texts. Still, maybe if you can say something about that. Of course, you were forced to leave something out, but sure. I do think that this was really a good working hypothesis in there. And so it would be nice to hear more about that, to elaborate on that.
Sure. Thank you very much, Metlika, for your kind remarks. I agree with you. I would be the first one to say this is one of the weak spots of the thesis. And it really broke my heart while submitting it, because it really, it's so sad to have results and not be able to present them. But I guess I'm very wordy. So when I try to express myself, pages grow and grow and grow, and I still have more things to say. So I simply didn't have time and enough time to do it, and it is a very, very ambitious project. And I knew this from the start, and many people told me, like, you should perhaps cut down because it will be too much. And yeah, they were right. Still, I thought it was worthy giving it a try. And this thing is extremely important. I only touched the surface over there, because cholera is by definition Asiatic, and that is something that we could already find in other plague narratives. But that gets so much, it gets really intensified in the 19th century, when the plague also starts to be called Oriental plague. And we have to remember that the bacillus, the Yersinia pestis, is discovered in Hong Kong. So you have this clear connection between the two. At the start, Broussais in Paris even hypothesizes that perhaps the Black Death was caused by cholera in the first place. So you do have this relationship to Asia. And there has been much debate within the medical humanities on the role science and medical science specifically had in controlling and in allowing for colonization, for imperialism, and different non-European bodies, and etc. So what I found is striking is that cholera is always a paramount of Orientalism. You see it in literature, you see it in caricatures. So in some caricatures, cholera has a Chinese cube, wears Indian clothes, and has a turban. So it is a mismatch of Chinese, Muslim, and Indian, and then sometimes you see this, and even the Americas are in there sometimes as well. So everything that is non-European is linked to cholera. There is also a certain insistence and a link to horror as well. So you see this exploration that I haven't really discussed much in the thesis, but many horror stories analyze that. And then, for example, Edgar Allan Poe, of course, but Marcel Schwab, the French writer, he has a text on cholera, and it is extremely xenophobic, and it has all the elements of Orientalism. And it is a horror story. And also, in this chapter, I was planning to end up with a discussion of texts like The Unparalleled Invasion by Jack London, in which it's a text from 1916, I think. And it really clearly advocates for the genocide of Asians. It's really baffling to read nowadays because it's so problematic in so many levels. And it's about this future war in which the whole world unites against China, and they bombard China with plague, cholera, typhoid, and yellow fever, I think. And then all the population gets exterminated, and those who survive these 4 diseases, they are gunned at the borders by the jointed armies of Europe and the United States. And this is truly celebrated. So, yeah, and then you see, we are in this moments of the rise of fascism, eugenics. So you have many different things. It's extremely complex. But I found this very striking. There is another passage also in another text, in The Painted Veil by Somerset Maugham, which I haven't analyzed in the thesis as well, and it's a pity, in which the main character, she's at an orphanage in Hong Kong, I believe, for children who lost both parents to cholera. So these are all cholera orphans. And she's looking at them and thinking, these creatures are hardly humans. And these are the words of the text. They don't have faces. They have I don't remember. They have grimaces or something. So the whole language is extremely problematic. And it said twice that they are not humans. They are less than humans. And you have this relationship to cholera. Not necessarily that cholera is a proof of their lack of humanity, but somehow the two things interact in very complex ways. Yeah.
Thank you. Please, Russ Willis.
Thank you very much. Aureo, I might pick up on that and sort of moving forward and away from broader questions on structure, organization, etc., choices you've made into the chapters themselves. I think jumping over chapter 1, which Martina was really discussing in her last question. But in chapter 2, for example, but this returns again, perhaps especially in the final chapter, but also elsewhere, in chapter 3 particularly, you do turn to focus on what I guess might broadly be called a kind of politics of cholera. And really that's what you've just been talking about as well. It's a particular colonial politics, of course, you've just been discussing, but it does come through in other ways. That underpins or at least a kind of train of thought which runs from chapter 2 onwards. And in chapter 2, it's articulated largely or primarily through Orientalism briefly, but then through a broader idea, which is what continues, I think, in your thesis, through the crisis of democracy brought about by cholera in the period you're examining. So that, for example, you identify literary texts as representing a kind of chaotic world, a society in breakdown, which suggests a kind of end or certainly delimiting factor for democracy. And of course, your work in chapter 3 on revolution in relation to cholera is quite similar. It's the same kind of breakdown of a particular political system or chaotic overthrow, or however you'd want to put that. Was that political understanding of cholera an important feature for you as you were beginning to examine the literature from chapter 2 onwards?
Great question, Martin. I guess yes, because the texts themselves, the example of revolution, for example, I found it surprising. I was not expecting this, and you see it like over and over. This idea of cholera tied with revolution. That's also tied, for example, in chapter 5, with the idea that the poor are linked to criminals, and the poor are the hotbed of cholera. So there is, in a certain sense, a link between criminality and cholera, of poverty and viciousness, and etc. So I do think that partly that arose from the texts, but also because it's difficult for us to separate pandemics from economics and politics, because they spread via certain nets, right? And this the military displacements, conflicts, trade networks, they're all extremely important for the way the pandemic, the cholera or any other disease actually spread. So I do think that became increasingly important, and there are two things to be said. First is that pandemics are chaotic by definition, and at these times measures have to be taken. It's a matter of organization of society as a whole, and so extreme measures that would not be justified in other scenarios are justified. So it's the perfect moment for you to cut rights and impose things, and quite often there is. Many studies show that they don't really turn back. So the rights you've lost at a certain point, you don't necessarily earn them again once the crisis is gone. So this is important. And I think a second element is the inherent idea within the metaphor of cancer, and if we go with Zontag or with epidemics, that there is a certain sense of demonization when you use the language or the metaphors of epidemics, and that was very useful. I don't think that's the only possibility for sure, but that was very useful. So I'm not really sure if I think that cholera is directly linked to the fascist movements in this sense, that there is a causal relationship, but rather that the discourses on epidemics, they create a dynamic of us against them, which is very useful. So you can, and we do see this, and I only mentioned very briefly, but the representations of Jews as syphilitic, for example, in Mein Kampf, it's a clear example of that. Or if we watch the Ewige Jude, the Wandering Jew, or the Eternal Jewel, I think that the documentary of the early 1940s, also you see very clearly the superposition of the plague and rats and mice, and then with the idea of Jewishness. So the usage of that, and that's very similar with what we see now in Brazil or the USA, which is it's blaming China. It's pretty much the same thing, and we have seen the rise of Chinophobia in a similar vein. So because this rhetoric is so useful for political means, I think it is unavoidable, I would say.
Yeah. I guess that one of the things, just to follow up a little on that, is that while I think you use the literary texts very well to reveal that, what I'm slightly less clear on is what are the positions of those literary texts in relation to that idea? So, for example, are the literary texts revealing this connection to a particular kind of right-wing ideology which is not apparent to a broader public? Or are they, as in the case of Jack London, celebratory of cholera, enabling that move to a right-wing politics? I guess the answer is probably, it depends on what text you look at. But I guess one thing I thought that may have been something you might have brought more to the surface would be that position of the particular text as you talked about.
Sure. I completely agree. It will depend. It will vary with the text, and there will be these two possibilities and others still, right? So sure. I would tie this suggestion, Martin, with the one prefaced by Professor King before to when I do some close reading analysis to as examples that could definitely come to the surface. I'll keep that in mind. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I'd like to comment on what you said. Sometimes when you explain things and you're so enthusiastic about your subject, which is wonderful, there are shortcuts. And you must be really careful. If you talk about worms, that's like extermination, that's like Hitler, that's like, it's not like. Because these are discourses, and one has to do research about them, and research has been done. So the language of extermination doesn't immediately come up with the worms. That's just not true. The language of extermination comes up with a certain, once the equation between human beings and bacteria is made, and that's a very precise point in history. That's after the 1880s. Before you have bacteria, there is no language of extermination of parasites. You exterminate parasites, that comes up with a phylloxera. I don't know how it translates into English. It's the vine lice. And they have been an enormous plague within German vineyards, and brought to the fore a kind of parasitic research which was on macroparasites, but that never produced the idea of human being parasites and then being entitled to genocide. You need further steps, and these are very important steps in history. So I would really, and when Hitler can say, Jewish people are like bacteria, they are like typhoid bacteria, which we all know, so you cannot only, you must exterminate them. This has had very precise precursors, a political language taking over the rhetoric of bacteria or bacteriology, and on the other hand, bacteriologists using a language of military oppression, of war, of weapons, and so on. And I'm sure you know all the research, because Bartmann is the one who did it, and I'm going to publish a monograph in 2 weeks, which also deals with it again. But that's all has all been done. So please don't make these shortcuts. And when people talk about worms, and when Ibsen is perhaps the first one who talks about macroparasites and kill them. And he is really, in a sense, visionary. And by the way, his Dr. Stockmann is not a good one. He's an ambivalent one, and he ends up as a terrorist. So just more close reading and no shortcuts. It really sort of makes me uneasy, gives me an uneasy feeling if you tend to say, we had that there, and then there, and then there, and then comes Hitler, and he does the same equation. It's not the same. And so it was just a remark I wanted to make, because I think that's really important. And then I have a just precise question. You talked about this caricature from Granville. You know what I mean. And you said of course it's a cholera caricature, and it says it's cholera. But you linked it to kind of medieval iconography, and I think it is a political caricature. I want you to comment, or I would like you to comment on the political, not background, just meaning, because that wasn't in your text, and it has a very precise political meaning.
The voivode, vie privée, vie publique des animaux.
I don't know what the title is. It's the caricature of Granville, where you said people in a room, someone is fleeing, four characters are fleeing, and the other one are lying down, vomiting.
Sure, vomiting.
Yeah, okay, exactly, and this has a clear and a very precise political meaning. It's a political narrative.
Sure. Which is in the le mystère attaqué du choléra morbus. No? I'm not really aware of what is the political meaning of this situation specifically.
But this is the main meaning of the caricature. So you should know about it, because the caricature has been published before cholera arrived in Paris. It was the idea that it's of course about the Julian monarchy, and the people who are there and who are vomiting gold. That's Perrier, and that's Louis Philippe, and then there's someone vomiting the hand of justice. And so it's a very clear narrative that the one who published the caricature, or the spirit behind, might the people of the Julian monarchy be killed by cholera, who is about to appear in Paris in order to free the poor. So this is not the subtext, it's just the meaning. And you just described it as a cholera caricature, and I think this is a very good example to be precise about historical context, because it's very easy to find.
Sure. Of course it has this meaning, of course, but there are also, what I use this caricature for is to discuss the suddenness of the attack, because clearly the people who are running out of the room, you need 2 seconds or even less to do that, to run that distance. And within these 2 seconds, you already have people like really dying and already blue. So what interests me in this caricature, at this point of the argument, is actually to show how the suddenness from the time span, it's absurd. A person will take a few hours actually to become bluish, and not 1 second. So what actually interests me here is actually two behaviors. First, the suddenness of the attack, which is very evident in the whole movement of the caricature, and also the fact that they are vomiting, because that's very rare. I've come across only, I don't know, with 5 or 6 times. So, and it's very explicit, but they don't vomit water. They vomit coins, and they vomit the hand of justice, and therefore. So, of course, caricatures, and especially political caricatures, they're charged with meaning. They have to use stereotypes in order to dialogue, because people have to recognize them. And of course, today when I see a caricature about Trump and coronavirus, I immediately understand, and people would do it at the time. So I would definitely, if I go into political history and understand the minutiae of the political problems at the time, I will be able to identify them, and this is very enrichful, definitely. But at this point of the argument, what I'm interested about is just these two elements. So yeah, it could definitely be enriched, definitely.
Yes. Just to connect to what Martin said, I think the history of cholera, the cultural history of cholera, and the history of politics in the 19th century is inseparable. And therefore, I would be just sort of, yes, I would use scrutiny with these caricatures, because they always tackle cholera and they tackle politics. So this is what Martin Ackerknecht came up in the late 40s, the movement of the anti-contagionists against the contagionists. This is also closely connected to revolution, to the 30 revolution, the 48 revolution. So the history of politics in the 19th century is the history of cholera, which is so fascinating, because I think never before and never after was the history of revolutionary movements in a century so closely connected to waves of pandemic. It did not happen with yellow fever. It did not happen with plague. It was always highly political. This is really the political history, and therefore it's just a suggestion.
Okay, thank you.
And I have a question actually, which again linked in at least in my mind, that takes us from that caricature forward. And what I was really interested in with that kind of caricature is the throwing up and the hideousness, etc., which you deal with at lots of points across the thesis. And in chapter 4, you particularly focus in on this, Aureo, on disgust. And you know, I was disgusted from chapter 1 onwards when you were giving us a sense of the ways in which the etiology of cholera moves through the human body, which in some regards I think set up very nicely that way of examining the literary responses to seeing cholera quite clearly. By chapter 4, you're then reflecting back on this. You're thinking about fear, you're thinking about disgust. And what interested me about that was that while, and I hesitate to introduce other things you could include, because I think it's obvious that this is very capacious as a study. Obviously, it's difficult to add in. But I was interested to know, why was it that you chose not to, for example, address some of the existing kind of conceptual materials that you could have drawn on? What struck me straight away with chapter 4 was you can think of disgust through writers like Mary Douglas's work on purity and danger and so on. I didn't see much of that in that, your focus fell on the primary literary materials, quite reasonably, I think, in writing about the literary imagination. Did you read and draw upon, in your thinking at least, Mary Douglas's book Purity and Danger, other work, for example, Kristeva on abjection, which I think would also have been interesting here, just to get a sense, if you like, of a kind of theoretical or conceptual scholarship which exists that you might have been able to include in certain ways.
Sure. I did not read Kristeva. I did so Mary Douglas. I included other sources like Rachel Hertz, which is a psychologist working with experimental psychology on disgust. A little bit of Elias, the civilizatory process. But what else? A few historians. But yeah, I did not do a theoretical discussion. It would be. Once we go into the theoretical discussion, we offer the flank for attack, right? Because once you do that, of course, I read. That is one of the aspects, the facets of the work. I got some expertise on it, but of course, I'm not an expert in disgust. So once you start to do the theoretical framework, you always be able to be attacked, right? So yeah, I was interested in this facets of the cholera representation, which is actually quite distinct from other diseases like tuberculosis, which is glorified, or even the plague or typhus. People just get feverish, and okay, in the case of the plague, you have the buboes, but they can even be hidden easily if you want. So it's very different from cholera because cholera is so profoundly humiliating. Especially, I tried to show how. The 19th century, it's so prudish, perhaps is the right word in English. So they are so sensible to all these bodily fluids and everything related to the body that that for them was even worse than for us. So diarrhea, all this focus on digeta and vomit. It's quite peculiar of cholera, and it's actually one of the ways I found to identify it in the texts. Because one of the things that I found striking throughout the research while reading about it is how much silence there is. How much silence. I thought, well, Balzac, for example. Balzac, it's so huge. His project is, I will write the France, I will recreate the literary France. And once you go to search for it, I could only find minor references. So I found this very, very surprising. The places where I expected to find it, and I didn't.
One of the things which I thought was really quite unique about what you did, you've touched on there, and that is the aesthetics of cholera as emerging through the kind of metaphoric language of the literary text that you look at. There's very clearly a cholera aesthetic, isn't there, which you've identified, I think. Mm-hmm. That would be something I would probably make a little more of if I were, revising this for a book or so on. Because I thought that was a kind of powerful part of what you were doing there, was revealing that once we're into the territory of cholera epidemics across Europe, where a number of writers are able to see for themselves the effects, there is a clearly new set of vocabularies emerging that are then used in these literary fictions and in broader kinds of writing as well, perhaps influenced by that first literature. I think that's an important element of what you've done here, actually, is to identify that. That I would do a little more with that. I guess that it's obvious, I think, that the kind of ask 10 people how they might reorganize your thesis and you'll get 10 different answers. And that's, I think, one of the issues you'll have in thinking about how to go forward with it is quite how does this extraordinarily rich and varied material come together that doesn't leave it too open for critique on the grounds of what's absent or what has been done perhaps too briefly, because it's not possible for you to do everything attached to cholera and the literary imagination in Europe for a century.
Sure.
In one book. And I think that's something that you'll need to think about as you consider what to do with it next. I won't give you the answer because you'll ask another 5 academics and you'll get a different 5 sets of views, but I do think that what Martina's been suggesting here as well is hugely important to think about. And how do you manage between that coming across a broad surface, which is valuable, but not only doing that, also stopping and then looking in depth. Does that mean case studies possibly? There's something, I think, there that needs a bit of thought. But I do think that aesthetics is really important.
Great. Thank you very much, Martin.
Yes, I would just, I couldn't agree more. I think that is an important thing of, you want this book to be successful, and it deserves success, really, because, as I said, the comparative approach towards the cultural history of cholera in the 19th century hasn't been there so far, and is really needed also within the history of cultural history of epidemics. But why not case studies? At least, perhaps, categorize your material in the sense that you have some major texts where you say, and they must not necessarily be in the most canonical ones, but I focus on this one, and this one, and I really closely link it to the medical historical context. Not because the context explains the text or the other way around, just it's the embedding which is necessary, and it should be more precise. And if you go so far and think about being selective, more selective, perhaps case studies, perhaps focus on some sort of major texts, why do you put such an emphasis on Defesa? I was wondering about that issue of silence, because cholera is at risk to develop or to turn into a super metaphor in your text where everything is cholera. Either cholera is in the text, then it's cholera, or cholera is not in the text, then it's also cholera. And why? For example, I was wondering why the 2 Shelley texts, I've been working with Mary Shelley too, but just in my medical humanities teaching. And of course, I always read it as an allegory, as an apocalyptic allegory. I mean, this is a genre, apocalyptic writing, and it brings up all the stereotypes of apocalyptic writing since St. John. And so I never asked myself which kind of disease is meant, or is there any kind of disease meant? Can there be a precise, and you yourself said it doesn't really matter. And I think there are moments where it really matters, because Heine talks about cholera, and apparently he means cholera, so cholera matters. But I really wonder if The Last Man is a good example, because it's clearly the whole book is a romantic example for apocalyptic writing, and it's dystopia and an allegory on society and on the Shelley circle and on whatever subjects, but it's so clearly romantic. And I must say, from the medical historical context, I mean, you make clear that there is some kind of scholar who proved, apparently, and we have to ask ourselves how far do we need philological proof, but apparently he proved that the Shelleys could have been aware of the damage that cholera did to British troops in India. I can say, from the standpoint of cultural history of cholera in the 19th century, it wasn't a thing in the cultural consciousness before 1830. It was just not there. And even if the Shelleys knew about the damage, your sort of proof is that the allegorical old woman becoming bluish or having a blue lips or a blue kiss. That must be cholera. And I wonder if that is a sort of course you can say that, but is that a plausible approach towards the Shelley texts? Aren't they? I mean, I'm not an Anglicist, I'm a Germanist, but we also have romantic circles. And this would be the last text where I expect some kind of mimetic mirroring of something that is there. And then adding that cholera wasn't there. It wasn't just there as a thing that was conscious in the public awareness. I would be very cautious, and I really couldn't. I don't know if I buy that. I mean, what you said about The Last Man, of course, is very interesting. You can say it's allegorical plague writing, it's epidemic writing, and your interpretation is very convincing. But my question is it suitable to pin it down to cholera? Mm-hmm. Isn't that ahistorical? So there are other texts, if you want to do cholera writing, as an analogy to plague writing, I would just stick to texts where you can clearly say cholera is in them. It's in Death in Venice. It's in Le Mystère de Paris. It's in Französische Zustände. That's very clear if you want to write about the aesthetics of cholera. But there's such a chapter on Defesa and such a chapter on The Last Man. And I think you could just bind your things more closely together, and it would be, you have so much material, and that's not difficult to be, I mean, of course it has to be done, but it is to be done, or it's not too difficult, and I think it would make your argument more convincing.
Thank you. That's fair criticism. I do agree that it's exaggerated in the case of Percy Shelley specifically, especially. And actually, it's there for, I think, two reasons. Because it was at the start of the work, it took too much time, and then perhaps I was emotionally attached to cut it out. But also because there's another chapter which was not written, which I also would like to work on in the future, which is the idea that the reception of cholera as a continuation of the plague. Mm-hmm. I actually think it is possible to argue that we take for granted that the plague disappeared after the 18th century. And historically, that's simply not the case. Plague continued all the way through at least the 19th century on the third.
No one thinks that. Sorry. I mean, there's a lot of plague writing in German expressionism, and we all know that there was the Hong Kong plague and the plague at the end of the 19th century when, yes, it was there. So I don't know why you say that.
When we read, for example, Rebecca Totaro, for example, or Jennifer Cook, Plague Theory and Film, it's often that scholars take for granted that plague disappeared as a threat, and then it only lived through in memory, in literature as memory. And I think it is possible to argue that actually the threat of plague, although plague did diminished in Europe, it is not really true that it vanished. There was the Moscow outbreak, there was plague in Bosnia, etc. But then I would argue that cholera took its place in the cultural imagination. So in a certain sense, cholera is a continuation of the plague in very complex ways. And so what I was trying to set the basis for, and then the project here collapsed, but with the Percy Shelley example, is to set the basis to show in a later chapter how the cholera topoi are actually directly linked with the plague topoi. So I do think there is a profound relation there, and I do think this continues in the 20th century. Bruno Jashinsky, I Burned Paris, for example. It's very clearly based on both. So that is my explanation for the presence of Percy Shelley over there. But for Mary Shelley, I do think that the argument holds more truth if we accept Alan Buell's reading of the novel, which is a close reading analysis. So I was basing myself on his interpretation and on the letters he analyzes and on their relationships, and I don't know the biography of the Shelleys intimately enough to understand who were their friends and when they met them, etc. But he shows in the book several of these possible dialogues, and he even interprets the Triumph of Life, the last and unfinished text by Percy, as actually discussing, as being a rereading of Petrarch, but us touching on cholera. So both texts are discussed in Romanticism and Colonial Disease, and I accepted his argument. I found it convincing. Perhaps I didn't do a good enough job in replicating his argument in the thesis, but yeah, I'll take that in consideration. Yeah, Percy. If I don't write the chapter on the plague, Percy certainly has to come out. Otherwise, there's a danger there. And the criticism is very fair.
I think there's probably, going back to Shelley's The Last Man, to Mary Shelley, there's probably a really interesting journal article to be written on The Last Man's reception history and how it's transformed over time to be reread as a cholera narrative, and it's being reread again now, isn't it, through the lens of coronavirus as well, as a suddenly hugely central romantic text, whereas for a number of years, of course, it was rather sidelined in favour of Frankenstein, when we were far more interested in technology, etc. And I think that there probably are elements of the work that you've done, Aureo, that might be better done as journal articles, where they don't align perhaps with the very main drive of your thesis. And that might actually give you a little more space when you're thinking of a book to do some of these other kind of scaffolding pieces that you need to be able to restrain the work a little more. And yet there's no need for you to kind of lose the scholarship, if you like, Consider a journal article possibly rather than discounting from the thesis as though that will now disappear. That I think there's probably a way of taking what is very extensive scholarship on your part forward in different kind of publication routes that will enable you to make the most of everything that you've done with this research. And I'd recommend you think about that aspect of it a little bit afterwards. If there are going to be things that perhaps don't fit a central narrative of a book, then perhaps, that's because they need separate treatment somewhere else.
That's a great tip. Thank you, Martin.
Well, I don't know if there are any more questions. I think we have a great discussion. So if you agree with that, we can briefly ask the candidate and his guests to wait for us in the waiting list, and we will discuss the evaluation a little further among us. And then in I don't know, maybe 10 or 20 minutes, we will be here again. Zelly, what do you say?
Yes, okay.
Okay.
I will put them into the waiting room.
Yeah, I didn't want to cut the discussion, so please, dear colleagues, if there's any more matters to discuss, but...
It's perfect. From my point, it's okay.
Okay.
And me. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you also. See you soon.